issue this week, a backtrack on the carbon tax on home heating oil, a move primarily aimed at Atlantic Canada.
We're adjusting policies so that they have the right outcome. We are doubling down on our fight against climate change.
The Conservatives have been hammering the Liberals on the tax, and today Poilievre claimed victory. Is this about good policy or good politics? Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down tonight. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne and Althia Raj. Good to see everyone. I asked there if it's good policy or good politics, but I could also ask perhaps it is neither. So I'll get everybody to weigh in. Chantal, how much of a surprise is this, and how much of a climb down is this for the Liberals?
On the core policy, they will tell you that it's symbolic, but symbols matter when it's your core policy. And it is a significant climb down. You asked, is it good policy or good politics? I think it's neither. It basically sends the message that everything is negotiable in the Liberal legacy, including the carbon tax. It also allows people who heat their homes with natural gas to ask, why not us?
Yep.
If heating is an affordability issue. Once you go down that path, why do you stop at oil? And it is impossible to sell this as doubling down, as the Prime Minister said, on climate change policy.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask that, Andrew. That the Prime Minister went to some lengths to say people can't get these these heating pumps they need in Atlantic Canada. This is going to buy them some time to do that, and we'll end up in a better place. Those are his words. I don't know what you make of that kind of justification.
Well, I think it's a lot more about trying to buy time or buy seats for the Liberal Party. Let's be clear, this is almost entirely about Atlantic Canada. When they talk about rural Canada, that's for the Liberal Party, that's mostly Atlantic Canada. They don't have a lot of rural seats anywhere else. When you talk about home heating oil, you know, that's overwhelmingly in Atlantic Canada. Everyone west of the Ottawa River, they're heating their homes with, or mostly heating their homes with natural gas or other types of things. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, if you're heating your home with natural gas, you don't get the tax break. If you do it with heating oil, you do. It only lasts for 3 years, conveniently, until after the next election. Then who knows what happens after that. I think what you're hearing is the sound of a dam bursting. Because, as Chantal said, if you can do it for this group of voters, so you're already seeing the NDP saying, why aren't you doing it for other types of voters? You're basically axing the tax, quote unquote, for some Canadians and not for others. You know, even in this country, that's a hard thing to really sustain. So I think you're going to see pressure now, and you're going to see pressure from within the Liberal caucus. Because when you're at 25% of the polls, it's harder for it to crack the whip if you're the Prime Minister than even if you're at 30 or 35%. And the problem he's really got is they're not even doing in a situation where they can replace him. It's not that people are going to be necessarily trying to get rid of him. It just may be that they'll start to not listen to him and not follow his lead. And so this is the kind of desperation moves you start to see to try and keep people within the tent.
Okay, so what about the idea, though, that Althia, that this does actually help people? That like that's what this is all about, was trying to help people, especially through the winter, and they're not going to have to pay this extra cost. Do they get any points for trying to deal with that issue?
Yeah, so I see it somewhat differently. I actually think this is an example of how politics is supposed to work. First of all, I think a lot of people don't actually understand how the carbon pricing system works, and the government has not invested a lot of capital in explaining to people how it actually is supposed to work. And yes, I'm not denying Andrew's point. You know, the Liberals started in June at 50% support in Atlantic Canada, and they dropped 20 points over the summer. The main reason being that the federal carbon tax kicked in as a federal backstop on July 1st, and people started to notice it. Combine that with Mr. Poilievre doing rallies all over Atlantic Canada and spending a lot of money on ads saying axe the tax and it's making everything more expensive. But you have a lot of MPs in Atlantic Canada, a lot of Liberal MPs in Atlantic Canada who have been hearing from their constituents that this is making life much more unaffordable rather. You know, I had an interview with many caucus members in the lead up to that big caucus meeting in September, and one of the gentlemen I spoke with Ken MacDonald from Newfoundland, one of the first things he told me was how he had told his colleagues about this widow in his riding who basically has a really hard time making ends meet. If the fuel charge was going to be what it is, she'd have to wear a blanket throughout the winter, that she can't afford chicken, she only eats it once a week when her niece comes to visit him, and there were going to be lots of stories in that direction. Yes, of course they're worried about losing seats. But also, I think there has to be a recognition that if you enact a policy, it has to be fairly applied. And it is true that people in Atlantic Canada don't actually have that many choices. Putting home heating aside, like they're all part of this announcement was also the rural rebate increasing to 20% as opposed to 10%. There isn't a bus service for them to take to go to work every day. So I don't think it's bad policy. I think they're making the policy more receptive to people who may not understand it. There's a lot of details missing from the policy. It is a pilot program now just for Atlantic Canada, so it would be nice to know a little bit more about how this is going to roll out. But it is okay to have a policy that is electoral based and also more practical, because at the end of the day, you want people to adopt more technology like the heat pump, so you have to make that accessible to
Andrew,
them.
go ahead.
It's one thing to be responsive. Let's remember that they do actually get the tax rebated to them, and they're going to increase the rebate. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But if the cost of these kinds of changes is you make the thing incoherent, then I think you've got to really wonder what you're achieving. Remember, to get part of the whole exercise of making the carbon tax work in the long term is people have to believe it's going to continue to apply. If they're going to make investments based upon that, long-term investments, they have to believe it's going to stick around. At this point, people have to be wondering, what's the next piece that's going to fall off? What's the next thing they're going to jettison to try and save their skins on this? And that's going to, I think, have really negative effects on people's long-term planning as to, is this going to survive the next election or even the next 2 years?
Okay,
but it's not just a halt, right? It's a halt in order for you to get more heat pumps on, like to replace your home heating. So like that part I think is really quite significant, and they can't be uncoupled.
Okay, Chantal.
I can't wait to see the rush on heat pumps in Atlantic Canada. But meanwhile, does anybody seriously want to argue that if the Liberals were ahead in the polls, they would have had today's announcement?
Absolutely
or
not.
Or that this is a doubling down on climate policy? Me, I look at this, and what I see is a government that is beholden to the NDP and to buy time to try to salvage itself, and that is being pushed by Pierre Poilievre into retreating on its core policies. And at the end of the day, I've watched caucuses walk to the slaughterhouse under Brian Mulroney, for one, because they believed in what they were doing. This, to me, is like Brian Mulroney waking up one morning and saying the polls are really bad, so I'm going to back off on the GST.
Well, that's a significant parallel. I'm sort of wondering why it didn't happen before now. You know, I mean, for all the points that you've all made, okay, it's not great to walk away from a core policy, but if you're going to do it, why did it take so long to get to a point where you thought that this was going to help people?
And why did you vote against it a year ago when a similar motion was presented?
A year ago this week. That's right.
Well, the answer is...
I don't think Ken MacDonald did.
No, Ken MacDonald didn't. Quickly,
no, but that's not the government
announcing. The answer is you're at 25% in the polls, and I think Chantal makes a very important point. This is going to really hurt Trudeau's moral legitimacy with his own base. I mean, he's in enough trouble with the rest of the country, but with his own base of people who, you know, would say what you will, he's done the right thing on climate change. If you rob the moral legitimacy of that by basically hollowing out the policy, then you're going to face the music on that too.
But what is the point of having a policy if no one actually changes their habits? So if you encourage them to change their habits, and they do, but this makes it easier for people to do so, right? Like I think that's a good way to.
You don't even know that they won't change the habits, because you're talking about something that kicks in on July 1st, and now suddenly it doesn't work. Also, that clip from the Prime Minister that says our price on carbon is not giving the results that we expected. Believe me, it's going to be taken out of context. I mean, Justin Trudeau has himself admitted that carbon pricing doesn't work.
Okay, last word
And
to Althia.
that is really damaging over the long term.
Last word to Althia, then I got
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I just think at the core of it, in a country, you want people to have buy-in to a policy that is like this, and fairness is important. And a lot of rural Canadians in Atlantic Canada and elsewhere felt that they were being punished for choices that they actually cannot make. So I don't think it's a bad thing that the government is responding to that.
Okay, I enjoyed that conversation. Thank you all. Okay, we're going to take a small break here, but when we return, we'll talk about Pierre Poilievre's private member's bill to ban vaccine mandates. Pierre Poilievre's private member's bill on vaccine mandates was defeated. Why is he still talking about them? That's next on The National. A push by Pierre Poilievre to ban vaccine mandates voted down by MPs.
Let us recognize that Canadians have freedom of choice over what they put into their body.
We have always stood up for the safety of Canadians while he chooses to wear a tinfoil hat.
But why is Poilievre talking about vaccine mandates again? Let's bring everybody back to talk about that and break it down. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Althia, why don't you start us off on this one? Obviously, this was a private member's bill. No one expected it to pass, but there were speeches and a lot of energy dedicated to it this week. What did you make of why this was happening?
Well, I have no choice because it was introduced and it gets second reading and then there's a vote. So it went as far as it could go.
Yeah.
But, this isn't a bill about vaccine mandates. It is specifically about COVID-19 vaccine mandates, basically about federal employees that are in federal industries being not having to have them be part of a mandate. So it's really a response to the 2021 campaign, and yet it was introduced last year, only for political reasons during the leadership race. It is completely dated. It has no point. I mean, it's kind of an embarrassment that even Conservatives that agree with this would think that this is worth wasting House time on, because it's a dead issue. Even when it was introduced, it was a dead issue. Right. So it is purely it's just an advertisement so Pierre Poilievre can put some targeted ads on social media. Beyond that, there was no point. So it's not a surprise.
Is it a risk to be talking about these things, Chantal, again, or is there too much, or is there a lot of benefit there to be raising it again?
And I don't think there's a lot of benefit there. I think anything that detracts from the cost of living conversation, where obviously, as mentioned before, they're doing fairly well, is not a good day for the Conservatives. It's also divisive because even within the Conservative Party, there's no agreement on this. And me personally, I have a bit of problem with a party that is so unanimous in defending bodily autonomy, but it is so divided on abortion rights for women. But that's just me seeing a contradiction on where bodily autonomy seems to stop for part of that caucus.
Andrew.
You might say the same for drug policy as well. Look, I think on the right they call this virtue signaling. It is supremely pointless. There was no way this was going to pass. It's pointless another way in that I don't see why you'd want to rule out in advance something that's been part of the public health toolkit in one shape or another for 200 years and just for COVID. And if it did come to that, you could be overturned by just passing legislation to make a vaccine mandate legal. So it's purely for show. It's purely for politics. I might disagree a little bit with Chantal in that I think if they were investing a great deal of time and emphasis and focus on this, absolutely, it would be pulling them away from their hardcore economic message in a way that wouldn't be helpful. But as a nod to the PPC type of voter and to that element of their own coalition, it's probably something in that of just keeping that locked down, giving them a hint, a signal that we're sympathetic to your concerns, and then you can go back to your economic messaging. So as stupid and pointless as it is, it may be good politics.
Chantal.
Of course, they're gambling, and I hope that they win that gamble, that within the next 2 years, we will not have a resurgence of this pandemic or a new pandemic.
Yeah.
I think, it's interesting what Andrew said about kind of throwing them a bone, because in Pierre Poilievre's speech at the Conservative Convention in Quebec City, his wife introduced him, and she had a nod to the truckers' convoy and how great it was to have them here in Ottawa. And so they are trying to keep that electoral cohort in the fold, if you wish. But they didn't really have a choice, because the alternative was to say to Pierre Poilievre that he doesn't make a speech. Like the bill had come in the schedule to be debated this week, so the vote was happening. If they had decided to yank him, the message would have been worse to those individuals. So I think, they didn't really have a choice.
Yeah, he was at a rally tonight, other than the axe the tax message. This came up at the rally again tonight, and it did get loud applause at a very large rally, another very large rally that he. But it seems strange to me that this would be an ongoing, motivating issue for a voter, Andrew. I can understand people might still be upset about it. I just don't know how it's still a motivating voter by the time we get to the next election, whenever that is.
It's not because it has any substantive importance. I agree with that. But in the realm of culture war, symbolic politics, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it. I wouldn't be talking about it much beyond today. Yeah. But as a way of just sending up a smoke signal, saying we get it, we understand your concerns. There's something in that.
What does that tell you then, though, Chantal, about Pierre Poilievre's leadership if he still has to do that, right? That he still has to engage in what Andrew calls a culture war.
That they're taking no chances, but I still believe that this is something that the Liberals, if they're still fit to campaign in a year and a half to 2 years, can exploit, because it is a real concern for many people, and it is a question that this does not bring a reassuring answer to for a majority of Canadians. What would happen if Pierre Poilievre was the Prime Minister during a pandemic?
A pandemic that might look very different, like a smallpox pandemic or something where,
could actually be worse.
Exactly. That he would be willing to deny himself a tool to use. I think to the point about mobilization, you still want, in this electoral cycle that we have and the fundraising rules that we have, you still want to keep your supporters in the fold. And one way to do that and to keep going back to them for money is to make sure that you're still talking to the issues that they care about. And so all of that is really just about keeping supporters that you brought into the tent mobilized and engaged and ready to knock on doors when the time comes.
And he may have a little more latitude to indulge in this as well, because I think a certain proportion of centrist voters may now reach the point where they're just bound and determined to get rid of the Liberals, and they will not be they'll be more willing to tolerate stuff that they don't like seeing from the Conservatives, because they've just kind of made that choice.
Well, especially if they think it's not going to happen again, or they hope it's not going to happen again. Yeah. We have to take a short break, but when we return, we'll look at how the federal government is responding to Alberta's plan to pull out of the Canada Pension Plan. That's next. Alberta's plan to leave the Canada Pension Plan is drawing concern from other provinces and the Deputy Prime Minister.
The CPP works really, really well for all Canadians, for all Albertans, and I am looking forward to the opportunity to discuss that further with the finance ministers of all the provinces and territories in the days to come.
So what's to be made of this desire to sit down with the other finance ministers, with the Ontario finance minister is the one who threw that idea on the table. Will it halt Alberta's plan? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. When Ontario put forward its letter saying it was very concerned, I went around the newsroom and said, Chantal said that last week on that issue. She knew that this was going to happen. So how significant is it, Chantal, for Ontario to say, no, hold your horses. This isn't going to work for us, and how might you expect this to unfold?
Well, the Alberta government so far has been basing its case on a study that it commissioned that shows that should it leave the CPP, it can take away 53% of whatever is left or whatever is in the fund. It's a no-brainer to know that Ontario might have something to say about that, given the population of Ontario. To imagine that Premier Ford or any Ontario Premier could just sit there and say, well, yeah, right, Alberta, just take half of what is left. I don't have to share with Quebec, so I'll be okay with this tiny portion you're leaving behind. So no surprise, but it did look very coordinated in the sense that the Treasurer of Ontario gives a news conference to talk about concerns that are legitimate, I believe. And almost instantly, the finance minister federally is saying we're going to have a meeting to talk about this, where Alberta will have no friends. for obvious reasons. And where I think the clear message will be from all the other provinces and the federal government, as it should be, that 53% is just not going to happen.
So if it's not 53%, then Andrew, would you expect them to walk away? Alberta,
Well,
I mean.
look, it's already in a lot of trouble in Alberta anyway, I think. But I think this is a helpful development in a couple of ways. One is it makes it harder to paint this as an Alberta versus Ottawa fight if you have other provinces also saying we think this is a terrible idea, including conservative provinces led by conservative governments. So you can't paint it as a left-right fight either. So that's helpful. And secondly, to the extent this thing was ever likely to get any traction in Alberta, it would only be on this fantasy accounting where they walk away with more than half of the assets. And the more that you can do to make it clear to Albertans that that is not going to happen, and you cannot simply, wishing isn't going to make it so, then I think that kicks whatever last remaining struts are out from under it. It just becomes basically ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I think this is helpful to broaden this discussion out and not just make it an Ottawa-Alberta fight.
Well, I think the Premier said this week that she would make sure she had the accurate figures before she put it to a referendum, because I guess they feel like they're hampered because they don't have all the data from CPP. So this is their best guess, I guess, at what they would get. But I would assume Albertans would want to know how much money would be coming out before they make any decision.
Lots of serious economists have provided them with more reasonable numbers.
Yes, they have, and they are not anywhere near what Alberta's put on the table. Althia.
But ultimately, it's going to be decided by politics and the courts, some combination of the two, not by economists.
Yeah.
And so that's also important to impress upon Albertans.
Althia.
Or maybe it will be abandoned, because one thing that the Alberta government said this week is that they are not going to go forward unless there is an approval in a referendum. So I think part of this is also convincing Albertans that this is a very selfish thing to do that will destroy the pensions of other Canadians across the country, and that they shouldn't do this. So it is looking actually like it is less likely to happen than it was last week, I feel. The other thing I thought was really interesting, or kind of cute, Dan Arnold, who used to do polling for Prime Minister Trudeau, is now at Polera, or back at Polera, and he tweeted a few weeks ago that Danielle Smith had found the only issue to unite Albertans with Justin Trudeau and against her. And the polling does suggest that most Albertans are not in favor of Danielle Smith's plan.
No, Chantal, you want to?
We should say it's not necessarily good for Albertans either. I mean, one of the things that the Alberta government doesn't seem to be able to give a straight answer on is, would this fund that they want to create of this, would this be invested purely by, professional pension fund managers and solely for the benefit of the beneficiaries? Or would the government be able to get its mitts on it in some way, shape, or form in order to advance some kind of industrial policy or to prop up the oil and gas industry or what have you? Yeah. So that has to be adding to the nervousness of Albertans on this.
And portability, would they be able to retire in Ontario if the pension fund is based in Alberta?
Or BC, or more likely BC, yes. Or wherever people decide to take retirement. I also think that it was helpful for Pierre Poilievre that Doug Ford stepped in. He rarely does things that are helpful to Pierre Poilievre, I've noticed. But on this, to have Conservative premiers from other provinces come forward and say, we don't think this is a good idea for anyone who is about to retire anywhere in Canada, is helpful to the Conservative leader, because he's not just siding with Justin Trudeau on the issue.
Okay, thank you, friends. We'll see you back here next week. Appreciate it. That is At Issue for this week. Don't forget, you can catch The National on YouTube and CBC Gem. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks for watching.